Long before stone pyramids cast their silent shadows across the endless sands of Egypt, before marble columns rose proudly in the hills of Greece, and before Roman roads stitched together a massive empire, a quieter but equally momentous story had already begun on the surface of our earth. It unfolded in a pristine landscape of thick mud and towering reeds, of unpredictable seasonal floods and searing summer droughts, a world of shimmering horizons where two great rivers carved their majestic way across the soil. This land was Mesopotamia, a name that carries the very weight of our collective origins, the land between the rivers. Good evening, and welcome back to History Before Sleep channel. Tonight, we are beginning a long, deeply immersive journey across the cold waters of time, entering a world of immense ambition, silent steel of human willpower, and the ultimate fragility of human hope. Our task is to walk carefully, hour by hour, through the entire epic story of Mesopotamia, letting the slow, steady rhythm of the narrative carry us deep into the memory of this world of mud, rivers, and stars. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It's always a comfort to see how many corners of the world come together in these quiet evenings. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What does it feel like to be absolutely certain that everything will go according to plan? To be so certain that you never pause to imagine another ending at all? And what happens when the safest and oldest structures of human life begin to transform so quietly that almost no one believes the reality of the grand changes until the old ways are gone forever? In the early spring of human civilization, a profound sense of absolute certainty began to shift, moving away from the wild, unpredictable forests and toward the regulated cycles of the earth. The name itself comes to us from the ancient Greeks, who centuries later looked back at this sacred geography with a sense of absolute awe. They joined their words mesos for middle and potamos for river, creating a definition that marked the middle land of the twin rivers. But for the first groups of human beings who wandered into this landscape tens of thousands of years ago, it was not a name, a definition, or a line drawn on a map. It was survival. It was an unexpected opportunity, a clean slate, and in time it would become their absolute destiny. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the two celestial arteries of this world, begin their long, independent lives far to the north, cradled within the snowy ridges and craggy, frozen mountains of eastern Anatolia in the land we now call Turkey. Fed by melting glaciers and persistent seasonal rains, the young waters tumble downward through rocky gorges, splitting into countless clear tributaries and carving deep valleys before finally spreading out into wide, flat floodplains as they descend south toward the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Between these two moving waters lay a vast alluvial plain, a territory both unforgivingly harsh and spectacularly generous, where nature possessed the power to destroy human effort in a single catastrophic flood, or sustain life indefinitely with an unblemished, life-giving fertility. It was precisely in this precarious, the volatile zone that humanity first dared to experiment with something radically and beautifully new. The choice to stop wandering, to drop their heavy traveling packs, and to stay put. To fully understand why this monumental transition occurred in this specific corner of the world, we must step back even further into the deep, structural past of our planet, moving to the great climatic shifts that marked the end of the last major ice age. For over 2 million years, the pattern of human life had been ruthlessly shaped by cyclical periods of intense glaciation. The Pleistocene world was cold, profoundly unstable, and often terrifyingly harsh for small bands of hominids who had to move constantly to survive. Enormous sheets of ice stretched across northern Europe and Asia, trapping unthinkable volumes of the world's water in the polar regions, lowering sea levels drastically, and forcing humans to adapt to a life of perpetual migration. But around 10,000 BCE, which means 10,000 years before the Common Era, the Ice Age slowly loosened its ancient grip upon the Earth. The world began to warm under a more persistent sun, Glaciers melted into roaring torrents, seas rose to fill the bays, forests expanded across empty tundras, and global rainfall patterns shifted completely. In the hills and rolling valleys of Southwest Asia, entirely new ecosystems appeared like a sudden gift. Wild grasses, the true ancestors of wheat and barley, began to grow in dense, rich abundance along the plains, while pistachio and almond trees dropped their nutritious harvests in open groves, and heavy herds of gazelle grazed the green hillsides. For nomadic hunter-gatherers, who had spent generations tracking scarcity across barren landscapes, this unexpected abundance was a magnificent blessing, but it was also a profound temptation. Why keep moving across mountains and deserts when the land beneath your feet now offered everything required to sustain life without the endless exhaustion of the trail? For tens of thousands of years, humans had survived solely by moving with the changing seasons, following the migratory tracks of wild animals, gathering wild berries and roots, and bending their whole existence to the unpredictable rhythms of the wild. Mobility was their only safety, and movement was life itself. Yet slowly, in this new, warmer world, some small bands of people made a choice that would alter the history of the world forever. They began to linger by the riverbanks, setting the stage for a revolution that would turn wanderers into builders and mud into cities. They watched the waters rise and fall. They saw how the seeds dropped by accident into the soft earth would grow into tall stalks weeks later, and they realized that they no longer needed to chase the world. They could stay, they could build, and they could wait. The climate shifts of the 10th millennium BCE were the silent architects of this new human reality. As the temperature stabilized, the Fertile Crescent, an arc of rich land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, became a sanctuary for life. The twin rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, carried millions of tons of nutrient-rich silt down from the northern mountains every single year, depositing this dark, fertile mud across the flat southern plains. When the floodwaters receded, they left behind a soil that was incredibly soft and easy to work, a soil that practically invited human hands to plant seeds and tend crops. It was a landscape of immense contrast, where a few yards away from the riverbank lay the barren, scorching desert, but along the water channels lay an Eden of green growth, teeming with fish, waterfowl, and wild game. Humanity had found its perfect cradle, a place where the challenges of nature were balanced perfectly by its rewards, forcing our ancestors to develop new tools, new structures, and an entirely new way of thinking about their place in the cosmic order. As you rest under the covers tonight, imagine standing on the banks of the ancient Euphrates River more than 11,000 years ago. The air is cool, the night is perfectly still, and the only sound is the soft, rhythmic lapping of the river water against the dark mud. Overhead, the sky is thick with a blanket of stars, brilliant and sharp, completely untouched by the light pollution of the modern world. The people sleeping in the simple shelters nearby are the very first humans to experience the profound quiet of a permanent home. They no longer worry about where they will walk tomorrow. They no longer scan the horizon for the movements of the deer or the mammoth. They have tied their lives to the rhythm of the river, trusting that the waters will continue to flow, that the seeds will continue to grow, and that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to require no special fear. This sense of peace, this gradual surrender to the stability of the earth, was the quiet beginning of everything we know today. It was the birth of security, the dawn of planning, and the foundational step toward the great cities and empires that would soon rise from this very mud. With these comforting thoughts in mind, let the steady flow of the ancient waters wash over your consciousness as we prepare to move deeper into the night, exploring how these first experiments in permanence hardened into the very walls and towers of our oldest history. The transition from a life of constant movement to an existence rooted firmly in the soil did not happen overnight, nor was it a sudden, dramatic awakening that spread across the pristine landscapes of Southwest Asia like a wildfire. It was a slow, deeply patient, and tentative accumulation of daily habits, a gradual, generational softening of the ancient nomadic impulse, as families realized that the earth beneath their feet could be trusted to repeat its generous gifts if they only remained close to its natural currents. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ancestors of our species had lived with their packs ready to move at a moment's notice, measuring security by their ability to flee scarcity and follow the migrations of wild beasts. But in this new, the warmer world that emerged at the end of the Great Ice Age, the very concept of home began to transform from a passing camp into an enduring sanctuary. Archaeology provides us with breathtaking, deeply cinematic glimpses of this monumental turning point in the human story, revealing the physical traces of households that chose to build for longevity rather than temporary shelter. In the northern reaches of Syria, at an ancient and highly celebrated site known to modern excavators as Abu Huraira, small groups of people began to construct circular huts made from sun-dried mud and thick river reeds around 9,500 BCE, which means 9,500 years before the Common Era. These early settlers still hunted the fast gazelle herds across the plains and gathered wild grains from the surrounding hillsides. But unlike their ancestors who routinely abandoned their camps after a few weeks of foraging, the families of Abu Huraira returned to the exact same clearings year after year, winter after winter. Beneath the deep, compacted floors of these simple dwellings, modern scientists found the silent, undeniable evidence of this new lifestyle, the bones of hunted game mixed intimately with the charred seeds of domestic barley and rye, and heavy stone mortars worn perfectly smooth from thousands of hours of repetitive human labor, crushing grain into flour. They had begun to realize that by staying close to the places where wild grasses grew, they could protect the patches from animals, harvest them with greater efficiency, and create a steady supply of nourishment that outlasted the seasons. Nearby, at the ancient site of Muribet, along the wide, sweeping bends of the magnificent Euphrates River, the exact same quiet story was unfolding beneath the timeless canopy of the stars. Families began to anchor their individual destinies to specific geographical coordinates, gradually replacing the temporary, skin-covered lean-tos of their wandering past with much sturdier, rectangular structures that featured built-in stone hearths for cooking and deep, protected storage pits dug directly into the hard earth to secure their food supplies from moisture and scavenging animals. This structural change represented a massive shift in human psychology, for when a family built a rectangular house with common walls, they were planning for a future that stretched across years rather than days. They were investing their physical energy into the ground itself, creating an asset that would be handed down to their children, and establishing a physical boundary that separated their personal space from the wild expanse of the open wilderness outside. But the greatest, most dramatic, and highly organized leap into absolute permanence took place farther south, within the deep, low depression of the Jordan Valley at a legendary site called Jericho. Around 9000 BCE, Jericho was no longer a simple temporary encampment or a basic seasonal village. It had transformed into a true permanent settlement, housing hundreds of people within a tightly knit community. Here, the early inhabitants achieved something entirely unprecedented in human prehistory. They constructed massive, formidable stone walls that completely encircled their homes, an immense collective effort that required hours of shared labor, meticulous engineering, and a unified social will. What drove these early humans to dedicate their limited, hard-earned energy to moving heavy blocks of solid stone? Was it the urgent need for defense against predatory rival groups looking to steal their resources? Was it a massive structural shield designed to redirect the sudden, violent flash floods that routinely roared through the valley? Perhaps it was both, but the symbolic message written permanently into the landscape was unmistakable. This was a home, a place of immense value, a collective treasure that could never be abandoned lightly. Most remarkable of all the structures built within these ancient stone fortifications was a monumental round tower that rose nearly 9 meters into the night air, featuring a complete internal staircase spiraling upward through its solid, heavy core. It stands today as one of the oldest surviving monuments of human stone engineering anywhere on the surface of the earth. Its true purpose still fiercely debated by historians, astronomers, and scholars across the world. Some suggest it was an early celestial observatory, its internal staircase and windows perfectly synchronized with the setting sun at the summer solstice, representing a profound act of early cosmic tracking. Others see it as a communal watchtower to scan the long valley for approaching threats, a protective platform for leadership, or a towering, majestic declaration of presence, power, and absolute permanence. Whatever its original function, the Great Tower of Jericho represented a tectonic shift in the human mind. Humanity was no longer merely surviving within the hidden pockets of the natural world, shifting safely from shadow to shadow like the wild animals they tracked. They were beginning to symbolize their presence, to alter the topography of the planet permanently, and to build heavy structures that declared their identity, their continuity, and their explicit intention to conquer time itself. Farther north, in the fertile, rolling highlands of Anatolia, around 7,500 BCE, another remarkable settlement emerged that would completely astonish future generations of archaeologists, a spectacular place known as Çatalhöyük. This was no ordinary village of scattered huts, but a massive proto-city, a dense, complex human hive home to perhaps 8,000 people living together in absolute, continuous cooperation. Yet, unlike the modern metropolises we inhabit today, Çatalhöyük was an urban expanse, designed completely without streets or alleys. The rectangular houses, built from uniform mud brick and heavy timber, were pressed tightly against one another in a solid, continuous block, accessed not through traditional front doors, but through openings built directly into the flat, thatched roofs. People moved across the settlement like ants across a highly structured hive, clambering from rooftop to rooftop, crossing wide-open terraces, and descending into their private domestic spaces by heavy wooden ladders that linked their living quarters to the sky. Inside these pristine, plaster-lined rooms, daily life was intensely spiritual, artistic, and experimental. The inhabitants painted their walls with vivid, terrifying images of wild bulls with massive horns, dramatic hunting scenes, and mysterious symbolic figures of women representing the life-giving forces of fertility. In many of these homes, the bones of the dead were buried directly beneath the raised clay platforms, where the living slept, cooked, and shared their daily meals, weaving the physical presence of the ancestors into the very fabric of daily survival. The village was a living tapestry, where past and present coexisted without a single barrier, each new generation literally building their lives upon the foundation of the bones that came before. Life here was dense, deeply communal, and highly structured, but even the great settlement of Çatalhöyük was not the ultimate birthplace of true civilization. It was the fields outside these mud-brick homes that carried the true spark of the human revolution, a gradual agricultural transformation that would soon find its ultimate, unstoppable expression in the fertile, mud-rich lowlands of the southern Mesopotamian plains. As you close your eyes tonight, visualize the rooftops of Çatalhöyük beneath a deep, velvet sky filled with the infinite light of the stars. Imagine the silent ladders reaching toward the openings in the roofs, and the absolute quiet of families resting right above the bones of those who walked before them. They found a way to bridge the past and the future by grounding themselves in a single place. Let the heavy weight of their timeless permanence settle into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you into a peaceful and undisturbed rest. The true engine of human transformation did not lie within the construction of stone walls or the plastering of mud brick huts, but in a quiet, observational relationship that developed outside the village boundaries. For countless generations, human societies had survived by chasing the seasonal abundance of the natural world, gathering wild grains wherever nature chose to drop them, and moving on when the supply was exhausted. But as the climate warmed, some bands of people began to linger in the fertile valleys, shifting their awareness from the sudden movements of game to the slow, predictable unfolding of the plant world. It was a transition that began with a choice to observe rather than consume immediately, laying the foundations for an agricultural mastery that would reshape the geography of the planet. For thousands of hours under the ancient sun, the women and men of the Neolithic world observed the wild grains that grew along the moist riverbanks and across the open plains. Wheat and barley swayed in the seasonal breezes, fragile, fleeting, and highly unpredictable. Yet, through this persistent, intergenerational observation, people began to notice subtle, critical differences among the individual stalks. They observed that certain stalks stood taller and stronger, successfully resisting the buffeting of the spring winds. They saw that some specific heads carried larger, heavier, and more nutritious seeds. And most importantly, they discovered that a few rare variants possessed husks that held their grains firmly to the stalk instead of shattering uselessly on the wind at the first touch of maturity. Through the slow, repetitive process of gathering, selecting, and deliberately replanting the seeds of the most useful plants, these early humans unknowingly guided the evolution of the vegetable kingdom. By around 8000 BCE, which means 8,000 years before the Common Era, the wheat and barley growing in the small, stone-lined plots of Southwest Asia were no longer wild grasses. They had become fully domesticated crops, reliant entirely on human hands for their planting, their protection, and their propagation. With the domestication of these grains came a completely new, unyielding rhythm of life that chained the human body to the soil. The calendar was no longer defined by the erratic migrations of wild herds, but by the strict requirements of the agricultural cycle, moving from the clearing of fields in the early spring to the careful weeding of the stalks through the summer, the heavy labor of the harvest in autumn, and the meticulous guarding of the seed reserves through the winter. Animals followed an identical path of systematic transformation, moving from wild predators and prey into managed assets of the emerging human community. The fierce aurochs, the massive, long-horned, and terrifyingly aggressive ancestors of all modern cattle, were gradually cornered, isolated, and brought under human control through generations of selective breeding that favored docility over wildness. Sheep and goats, once darting across the high, inaccessible rocky hillsides with a wild agility, were separated from their herds, kept in crude stone pens near the settlements, and transformed into gentle companions whose movements were governed entirely by the will of their human keepers. Pigs, naturally opportunistic scavengers, were drawn to the rich scraps and organic waste accumulating around permanent human villages, quickly adapting to a life of confinement in exchange for a steady, reliable supply of food. The structural implications of this dual revolution were truly staggering for the future of the human race. For the first time in the long story of our species, food was no longer something to be hunted, chased, or discovered by chance. It was something to be manufactured in predictable, reliable quantities. Hunger, which had stalked every nomadic band through the dark winters of the Ice Age, was no longer an immediate daily certainty. With the domestication of animals came a continuous supply of fresh milk, durable hides, spinnable wool, and meat on demand, turning the ancient uncertainty of the hunt into the calculated reliability of the managed herd, and providing the biological energy that would allow human populations to expand beyond their old boundaries. The daily life of these early farmers was a mixture of intense toil and gradual transformation. Men, women, and children worked side by side, clearing fields of heavy stones, pressing seeds into the soft soil, and tending the fragile green shoots under the hot sun. The natural world was no longer an untouchable force to be feared, but a canvas that could be reshaped by human ingenuity. Religion grew directly from this deep connection to the soil. Planting festivals in the spring and harvest rituals in the autumn became the core of communal life, as offerings were laid before simple shrines to appease the unseen powers that controlled the rain and the wind. If the seasonal rains failed, or if pests threatened the crops, the community turned to these sacred traditions for comfort, creating a shared system of belief that bound them to the land and to each other. With this newfound security came a widening of the human horizon, as trade networks began to link distant farming villages across plains and mountain passes. Surplus wool, grain, and hides were exchanged for exotic goods like obsidian blades from Anatolia, colorful shells from the Persian Gulf, and precious blue stones from distant mountains. Each community was no longer an isolated pocket of survival, but a node in a growing web of human contact, knowledge, and exchange. The human body bore the marks of this transformation, with skeletons showing the wear of repetitive labor, but the gain was undeniable. Survival was no longer left solely to chance, and the seeds planted in the ground were preparing to bear the fruit of civilization itself. As you rest quietly under the covers tonight, Imagine the vast, silent fields of ancient Mesopotamia resting under a canopy of bright stars. The sheep are quiet in their pens, the grain is secure in the storehouses, and the tools of the harvest rest against the mud walls of the homes. The people who labored under the sun are now fast asleep, their breathing deep and even, completely at peace with the rhythm of the seasons. They have successfully tamed the wild world around them, turning chaos into order and uncertainty into a quiet assurance. Let the steady, peaceful rhythm of their ancient harvest wash over your mind, letting your thoughts drift away into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The success of the Green Revolution brought into existence a phenomenon that humanity had never encountered in all the thousands of years of its wandering past: the creation of an agricultural surplus. In a good season, a single cleared field could produce significantly more grain than a farming family could consume in a year, leaving a heavy reserve of dried barley and wheat that could be stored away against future scarcity. Grains were poured into deep pits, lined with stone, packed into large baskets woven from river reeds, or sealed inside clay vessels, providing a buffer of security that allowed human communities to outlast the dry seasons and the cold winters. This agricultural surplus was a profound double-edged sword that carried heavy social and political consequences for the basic structure of the early community. What could be stored and preserved could also be coveted, raided, and stolen by hungry outsiders or less fortunate neighbors. A storehouse of grain was no longer just a collection of food. It was a physical concentration of wealth, security, and power, and its protection demanded a level of organization that went far beyond the simple consensus of a tribal family. Stored grain required heavy stone walls, permanent guards, and a collective discipline to maintain the defenses, forcing the early villages to cluster together into tightly defended communities. In this environment, a stolen sack of grain was not a single lost meal, but the potential destruction of an entire family's survival through the winter, making the defense of the surplus a matter of absolute life and death. With the creation of a reliable food surplus, a portion of the population was suddenly freed from the grinding necessity of constant food gathering, allowing individuals to step away from the fields and devote their entire lives to refining other specialized skills. Entirely new classes of human beings emerged within the village walls: potters who labored over the clay, weavers who spun the wool of the herds, toolmakers who chipped the local flint with an unprecedented precision, and eventually, early metalworkers who experimented with the melting of copper ores. A new concept appeared across the Mesopotamian world: specialization of labor, creating a highly interdependent society where the farmer relied on the craftsman for his tools and the craftsman relied on the farmer for his daily bread. Yet, this rising complexity also birthed the first permanent structures of social inequality and political hierarchy within human history. As some families managed their water, their soil, and their herds more effectively than others, they began to accumulate a disproportionate share of the stored capital, transforming their material success into permanent social status and authority. The ancient egalitarian spirit of the nomadic hunting band, where all resources were shared immediately to ensure collective survival, vanished before the concepts of private property, inherited wealth, and unequal distribution. Villages divided themselves into households of greater or lesser wealth, and some families began to control vast herds, while others depended entirely on the generosity or employment of their wealthier neighbors. Leadership was needed to organize the massive irrigation networks, to resolve the rising tide of property conflicts, and to defend against raiders who saw in a grain storehouse a prize worth seizing. Leaders emerged, at first perhaps chosen by consensus and wisdom, but later by inheritance, strength, or spiritual claim. The seeds of politics, hierarchy, and organized law sprouted from the cultivated fields as surely as the wheat itself, transforming the loose, democratic assemblies of old into structured systems of authority where a few individuals held the power to command the labor and loyalty of the majority. As this hierarchy hardened, ritual and religious practices grew alongside the social changes to provide meaning and legitimacy to the new order. Farming was always an uncertain venture, placing the village at the complete mercy of shifting weather patterns. sudden insect pests, and unpredictable river movements. To secure their wealth and ensure future abundance, communities turned to unseen cosmic powers for permanent protection. Small shrines became gathering places where spiritual leaders or respected elders performed rituals for fertility, rain, and a bountiful harvest. Over time, these small shrines began to act as the primary centers for gathering and releasing grain reserves in times of need, intertwining the economic survival of the community with the sacred authority of the gods and preparing the ground for the rise of institutional priesthoods. The surplus also allowed human minds to imagine a world beyond the simple mechanics of daily survival, giving birth to early artistic expression, music, and decorative crafts. Pottery evolved from basic utility into a beautiful art form adorned with intricate geometric symbols, and stone carvings appeared depicting animals, people, and early myths. Simple flutes, made of bone, and rhythmic drums accompanied the communal gatherings and agricultural rituals, providing a voice to human longings, fears, and triumphs. For the first time, humanity possessed the time and the resources to beautify their environment, to leave behind a permanent trace of their identity, and to weave a rich tapestry of culture that would outlast the very individuals who created it. As you rest quietly under the covers tonight, visualize the heavy pottery jars and deep storage pits of ancient Mesopotamia, filled to the brim with the golden harvest of the fields. The guards are standing watch at the village gates, the craftsmen have laid down their tools for the evening, and a quiet stillness rests over the entire community. The anxieties of scarcity have faded into the background, replaced by the secure, heavy weight of abundance and order. Let the comforting thought of this permanent security settle into your mind, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep and undisturbed sleep. Around 6000 BCE, another quiet but entirely revolutionary technology transformed the daily texture of human existence across the emerging settlements of Southwest Asia. Before the mastery of fired clay, the storage of food, seeds, and precious liquids depended entirely on baskets woven from wild reeds, dried animal skins, or stone bowls painstakingly carved from solid rock. But these primitive containers possessed severe practical limitations. Baskets were easily chewed through by rodents and leaked fine grains. Animal skins rotted over time, and stone bowls were incredibly heavy and tedious to shape. The discovery that wet, malleable clay could be hardened permanently by the intense heat of a controlled fire produced a material that was lightweight, highly durable, and completely waterproof. For the first time in history, the precious agricultural surplus could be stored securely against the twin threats of moisture and pests, ensuring that seeds remained viable for planting through subsequent seasons. Liquids like fresh river water, milk, and early fermented beers could be transported across vast distances without a single drop of loss, and raw ingredients could be boiled and cooked over open fires, expanding the human diet and making food easier to digest. It is difficult for us, living in a modern world surrounded by plastic and metal, to truly appreciate how monumental the invention of pottery was. But in the Neolithic world, the clay jar was the ultimate technology of stability, allowing communities to grow larger, safer, and far more complex, protecting their resources from the decay of time. As the centuries rolled on, pottery evolved from a purely functional utility into a profound medium for artistic expression and cultural identity. Artisans began to paint the smooth surfaces of their jars with intricate geometric designs, stylized figures of wild animals, and complex patterns that signaled to neighboring villages exactly who had made the vessel. These beautifully decorated pots became highly valued luxury items, moving along early trade routes that linked distant settlements across mountains and plains. The humblest clay pot resting silent in the dark corner of a mud brick home was more than a simple container. It was a physical testament to a human group that had mastered the elements of earth and fire to anchor their lives securely to a single chosen spot. The development of the fast pottery wheel further accelerated this industrial transformation, allowing specialized artisans to produce uniform vessels in a fraction of the time it once took to shape clay by hand. Kilns became larger and more sophisticated, utilizing controlled drafts to reach the intense, even temperatures required to vitrify the clay and make it fully impermeable. This technological leap created a booming domestic industry within the early proto-cities, shifting the production of pottery from a part-time household chore into a highly respected, full-time profession. Workshops clustered together along the banks of canals, where raw clay was easily harvested, and wood or reeds could be floated in to fuel the gluttonous fires of the kilns. With this mass production came an unprecedented standardization of trade, as uniform clay jars became the recognized units of measurement for oil, wine, grain, and beer across the ancient Near East. Merchants could now estimate the value of a shipment simply by counting the number of standard vessels stacked inside a boat or laden upon a pack animal, simplifying transactions and reducing disputes in the crowded marketplaces. The clay jar had become the first universal currency of storage, a material anchor for a growing economic network that tied farmers, craftsmen, and traders into a shared language of value and exchange. Inside the warm domestic spaces, the presence of these vessels fundamentally altered the daily routines of the family, particularly regarding the preparation of food and the rearing of children. Soups, stews, and porridges could be simmered for hours over gentle hearth fires, turning tough grains and wild roots into soft, highly nutritious meals that could sustain the very old and the very young. This change in diet contributed directly to an increase in child survival rates, causing family sizes to grow and deepening the demographic strength of the permanent settlements. The clay pot, simple and silent, functioned as a protective shield for the lineage, holding the nourishment that allowed each new generation to grow stronger than the last. As night fell over the workshops, the fires of the kilns were left to die down slowly, casting a warm, dim orange glow across the stacks of newly fired pottery cooling in the courtyards. Scribes and accountants would make faint marks on wet clay tags attached to the jars, recording the ownership and the contents of each vessel before locking the storehouses for the night. Culture, art, utility, and survival had completely fused within the material of the clay, leaving behind an unblemished record of human ingenuity that would endure in the soil for thousands of years after the empires had crumbled into dust. As you rest quietly under the covers tonight, picture the long rows of clay jars resting in the deep, quiet storehouses of ancient Mesopotamia. The clay is cool to the touch. The designs painted upon their surfaces are still and beautiful under the starlight, and the liquids inside rest undisturbed by the passage of the hours. The intense heat of the day's labor has vanished, leaving behind only the solid, durable shapes of human achievement. Let the deep tranquility of these ancient vessels settle into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a peaceful and undisturbed sleep. The true, definitive transformation of Mesopotamia began when human groups turned their eyes away from the rain-fed hills of the north and dared to descend into the wide, sun-baked plains of the south. Here, the Tigris and the Euphrates ran wide and deep, carving a path through an arid landscape where rain rarely fell during the blistering summer months. The two great rivers were wild and completely unpredictable. In the late spring, swollen by the rapid melting of snows in the distant Anatolian mountains, they would burst their banks in violent, chaotic floods that could wash away whole settlements in a single afternoon. In the summer, the waters would recede drastically, leaving the flat plain parched, cracked, and dry beneath an unrelenting sun. Within the thick, dark layers of silt deposited by these annual floods lay an unmatched agricultural potential, a soil so rich and fertile that it held the power to sustain thousands of lives, if only human intelligence could learn to control the erratic flow of the water. Through a monumental collective effort spread across generations, the early settlers of the southern plain learned to do exactly that, transforming themselves from passive victims of the rivers into active engineers of the landscape. They dug long canals to channel the spring floodwaters deep into the dry interior plains, built massive earthen dikes to protect their homes from destruction, and constructed sophisticated wooden sluice gates to regulate the flow of water into their parched fields. This great leap into irrigation agriculture was not merely a technological innovation. It was the ultimate catalyst for the birth of an organized human society. No single family, No independent household could ever dream of constructing or maintaining a complex irrigation canal alone. It required hundreds of individuals working in absolute, disciplined cooperation to clear the heavy mud, reinforce the fragile banks, and clear away the choking river weeds year after year. Rules had to be established to ensure that water was distributed fairly among different fields, and managers were needed to coordinate the massive communal labor. In the muddy channels carved into the Mesopotamian plain, humanity dug the very first foundations of institutional government and bureaucracy. Learning that to control the great rivers, they had to learn to manage each other. The expansion of these water networks completely altered the geography of the alluvial plain, transforming barren deserts into highly productive fields of emerald green. Agriculture spread far beyond the natural narrow banks of the rivers, allowing the land to feed a rapidly expanding population that clustered together in growing settlements. But the rivers were strict teachers, punishing any lapse in cooperation with immediate disaster. A leaking dike or a blocked channel upstream could drown a neighboring crop or leave a downstream community completely parched, making mutual responsibility the absolute law of the plain. Councils met regularly under the shade of palm trees to schedule the clearing of silt, to distribute the water volumes, and to resolve the intense arguments that naturally arose over water rights. From these practical necessities emerged the first specialized public overseers, individuals chosen for their wisdom and fairness to manage the water networks, monitor the flow levels, and punish those who took more than their designated share. This early administration operated directly in the mud, far removed from the grand palaces of later empires, yet its meticulous records and strict regulations were the structural skeleton of the emerging state. Society was being shaped by the fluid dynamics of the twin rivers, learning that individual survival was entirely impossible without absolute submission to the collective plan and the shared maintenance of the communal infrastructure. The labor was continuous and exhausting, requiring men and women to wade through the thick mud under the blazing summer heat, clearing obstructions and carrying heavy baskets of earth to reinforce the levees. But the reward for this toil was an unprecedented, spectacular abundance that turned the southern plain into the breadbasket of the ancient world. Fields of barley and wheat grew dense and heavy, dates matured in rich clusters along the channels, and the newly created marshes teemed with fish and waterfowl that supplemented the communal diet. The landscape had been completely humanized, turned into a magnificent working machine where the natural currents of the earth were harnessed to provide permanent security and wealth for the community. As the sun set over the plains, casting long dark shadows across the long networks of canals, the water sparkled like lines of liquid silver cutting through the dark earth. The heavy wooden sluice gates were lowered quietly into place, holding back the weight of the currents and ensuring a steady, calm flow through the night. The wild nature of the Tigris and the Euphrates had not been completely tamed, but human cooperation had built a protective shield around the settlements, allowing our ancestors to rest quietly with the knowledge that the water was no longer an enemy, but a servant of their destiny. As you rest quietly under the covers tonight, imagine the long, peaceful canals of ancient Mesopotamia flowing silently beneath a vast canopy of stars. The water moves with a slow, gentle murmur through the dark fields, feeding the roots of the grain and reflecting the brilliant light of the heavens upon its smooth face. The heavy tools of excavation have been laid aside. The workers are resting peacefully in their mud brick homes, and a profound, soothing quiet has settled over the entire cultivated plain. Let the steady, rhythmic flow of these ancient currents wash over your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep and undisturbed sleep. By 5000 BCE, in the deep southern reaches of Mesopotamia, where the wild currents of the Tigris and the Euphrates fanned out into expansive, labyrinthine marshes and shimmering plains, human settlements began to cluster and expand with a dramatic intensity. This low, flat region, far removed from the rain-fed hills of the north, became the unexpected crucible for the next grand experiment in human organization. Names that would much later evolve into enduring global legends: Eridu, Uruk, began their long existence here as modest, fragile farming villages. Their early homes, constructed from sun-dried mud brick and thick bundles of marsh reeds, clung tightly to the edges of the newly carved irrigation channels, vulnerable to the caprices of the water, but sustained by its infinite fertility. Life in these delta hamlets was still raw, demanding, and balanced upon a thin margin of survival, yet the hidden potential of the landscape was immense. According to later Mesopotamian historical and religious traditions, Eridu was not merely an old town, it was the absolute first city ever founded on the surface of the earth, established directly by the great gods themselves at the very beginning of time. Modern archaeological excavations through the deep strata of the southern plains have shown that by 4800 BCE, Eridu had indeed developed into a significant, permanent center of community life, organized around a small, sacred shrine dedicated to Enki, the primordial god of fresh water and practical wisdom. This early building was far more than a simple place of refuge or prayer. It served as a vital communal anchor, a physical space where the scattered population could gather to worship, to trade their surpluses, and to organize their collective labor across the plains. Uruk, too, was quietly taking root during these early centuries, existing at first as nothing more than a fragile cluster of agricultural homes nestled near the wide irrigation channels of the interior. But even in this infancy, the seeds of a monumental destiny were being planted deep within the rich alluvial mud. The common farmers worked tirelessly to clear the canals. The shepherds herded their expanding flocks of sheep along the margins of the desert. The potters shaped their utilitarian clay vessels on early wheels, and a distinct class of priests or elders, wise in the sacred rituals, began to assume an active role in guiding the daily affairs of the community. The simple equality of the ancient tribal past was slowly dissolving into a structured matrix of roles, responsibilities, and permanent duties, preparing the southern plains to step completely out of the twilight of prehistory. The growth of these southern settlements was profoundly shaped by their unique environment, where the proximity to the marshes offered a diverse abundance of resources that complemented the heavy labor of the grain fields. Bundles of tall marsh reeds were harvested daily, woven into sturdy mats, construction beams, and even lightweight, agile boats that allowed the inhabitants to navigate the vast watery networks with absolute ease. This maritime connection turned the early villages into natural hubs of contact, where small trading boats could glide from one settlement to another, bartering fresh fish, wild fowl, and reed textiles for the agricultural yields of the inland fields. The rivers were not dividing barriers, but open highways that encouraged exchange, communication, and a shared cultural identity across the southern delta. As the population within these centers expanded, the physical architecture of the settlements began to alter, leaving behind the chaotic arrangement of primitive camps to mirror a beautifully organized community layout. Domestic homes, constructed with sun-dried mud bricks that insulated the interior from the searing daytime heat, clustered systematically around the central temple precincts and the shared water storage channels. Neighborhoods began to form based on specialized skills, with potters, weavers, and fishermen occupying distinct quarters where they could share tools, materials, and techniques. This early spatial organization was a natural expression of order and predictability, creating a secure environment where strangers could live side by side under the shared protection of the town's defensive walls and water management systems. The maintenance of this urban order required a continuous dedication from every inhabitant, as the fragile mud brick structures and shallow canals were constantly threatened by the natural erosion of wind and water. Public plazas and wide walkways were cleared regularly. Dikes were reinforced before the arrival of the spring floods, and the central shrines were expanded and beautified by the collective labor of the citizens. This shared investment in the physical structure of the town fostered a deep sense of civic pride and permanent belonging, transforming the scattered footprints of old into a unified, enduring community identity. The foundations of the urban world had been completely established in the southern mud, creating a pattern of collective life that would soon redefine the scale of human ambition across the ancient Near East. As the moon rose over the southern plains, casting its soft, silver light across the quiet roofs of Eridu and Uruk, a profound peacefulness settled over the entire delta. The small reed boats were moored safely along the canal banks. The fires of the domestic hearths had died down to gentle embers, and the inhabitants rested quietly in their insulated homes. The ancient rhythms of the rivers continued to pulse through the dark waters outside, but within the settlements, humanity had successfully constructed a sanctuary of stability and order. Let the deep, soothing calm of these first southern towns wash over your consciousness, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep and undisturbed sleep. Looking back across the vast ocean of time, we can see with absolute clarity that the foundational pillars of true civilization were being laid down piece by piece within these early southern settlements. The choice to build permanent homes, the mastery of systematic agriculture, the systematic accumulation of an economic surplus, the rise of specialized labor, the invention of durable pottery, the collective organization of irrigation, and the creation of central temples were no longer isolated experiments. None of these monumental developments were sudden, accidental discoveries or the result of a single spark of genius. Each one unfolded with a slow, intergenerational patience across centuries of trial, error, and hard physical toil. And though the common farmers and craftsmen who inhabited those early mud brick hamlets could never have fully anticipated the immense global scale of what they were initiating, they were standing directly upon the threshold of something vast, brilliant, and completely unprecedented in the story of the human race. From these humble beginnings, along the wild riverbanks, would soon rise soaring temples that scraped the open sky, complex cities that housed tens of thousands of strangers in peace and war, and kingdoms that would stretch their power across distant horizons. Out of the simple clay tokens used by early accountants to track bags of barley would emerge the miracle of writing itself, transforming the fragile human voice into an enduring, wedge-shaped script that could conquer death and preserve human memory for millennia. From the delicate, tense balance between daily survival and agricultural abundance would come the world's first structured experiments in royal kingship, codified law, universal justice, and highly organized society. The land between the rivers was never an easy, welcoming paradise. It remained a dangerous territory of catastrophic spring floods, scorching summer winds, and profound environmental uncertainty. But it was also a land of infinite possibility, an open arena where the first sparks of human civilization glowed with a persistent, brilliant light that would soon ignite into an unquenchable flame, drawing people from all horizons into its warm, protective circle. The convergence of these distinct cultural achievements created a profound momentum that began to shift the very cognitive landscape of our species. Humanity was no longer merely responding to the external pressures of nature, shifting passive habits to survive the caprices of climate and wildlife. Our ancestors had begun to actively design their world, using symbols, architecture, and administrative rules to create an artificial environment of predictability and order. This grand transformation was accompanied by a deep, beautiful flowering of early intellectual pursuits, as minds, freed from the constant, daily fear of starvation, turned to study the movements of the stars, the mathematics of land measurement, and the creation of foundational narratives that explained the cosmic order. Temples became the great schools and laboratories of this new world, where knowledge was systematically accumulated, recorded upon clay, and passed down to each subsequent generation with a meticulous care. Scribes and scholars labored in the quiet courtyards, defining the early systems of weights and measures, calculating the changing cycles of the seasons, and composing the magnificent hymns that celebrated the harmony between human cities and the divine heavens. This baseline of shared knowledge provided a solid framework for the expansion of human intellect, ensuring that the hard-earned discoveries of one century became the common, uncontested tools of the next, and lifting humanity into a shared consciousness that crossed the boundaries of family and tribe. The physical landscape of southern Mesopotamia became a visible testament to this supreme civilizational triumph, with the dark alluvial plain transformed into a dense, beautifully structured matrix of canals, fields, roads, and soaring cities. The raw mud of the earth had been systematically elevated into monumental architecture, administrative efficiency, and enduring artistic expression, establishing a permanent baseline of human achievement that would serve as the ultimate blueprint for every empire to follow. The dawn of civilization was complete, and the spark ignited in the muddy fields along the Tigris and the Euphrates was prepared to illuminate the entire course of human history with an unquenchable, magnificent brilliance. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the plains of Mesopotamia, imagine the infinite, ancient landscape resting in a state of absolute, beautiful tranquility under the star-filled sky. The roaring waters of the canals have slowed down to a gentle whisper. The great ziggurats and white temple walls gleam softly in the moonlight, and the entire urban world rests in a deep, secure slumber. The long, exhausting journey from wandering nomads to organized, permanent settlers has been successfully completed, and humanity has found its enduring home in the ground. Let the profound, comforting weight of this ancient triumph wash over your consciousness, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The transition from a life of constant movement to an existence rooted firmly in the soil did not happen overnight, nor was it a sudden, dramatic awakening that spread across the pristine landscapes of Southwest Asia like a wildfire. It was a slow, deeply patient, and tentative accumulation of daily habits, a gradual, generational softening of the ancient nomadic impulse, as families realized that the earth beneath their feet could be trusted to repeat its generous gifts if they only remained close to its natural currents. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ancestors of our species had lived with their packs, ready to move at a moment's notice, measuring security by their ability to flee scarcity and follow the migrations of wild beasts. The choice to settle permanently reshaped the human world, altering not only the physical landscapes of Mesopotamia, but the very biological structures of human bodies, minds, and social relationships. The shift into a permanent lifestyle brought an array of immediate physical challenges that early hunter-gatherers had never faced in their mobile past. The bones of the first permanent farmers, recovered from the deep strata of ancient villages, reveal a stark and unexpected toll compared to their roaming ancestors. These early agriculturalists were shorter in stature, their spines were bent and scarred from the daily grind of carrying heavy water jars, and their teeth were far more prone to decay due to a monotonous diet heavily reliant on starchy, stone-ground grains. Crowded settlements created an entirely new environment where infectious diseases could flourish, and living in close proximity to domesticated herds introduced new illnesses to human communities. Yet, despite these undeniable physical hardships, the permanent farming communities possessed an unstoppable demographic advantage. The steady abundance of stored food allowed more children to survive infancy, causing human populations to swell and permanent villages to expand outward across the plains. What they lost in individual physical health, they gained in sheer, collective numbers. The human mind was forced to shift its fundamental orientation from the immediate present to the distant future, learning to think in terms of seasons, life cycles, and long-term investments. Families were no longer merely reacting to the sudden opportunities of the wilderness. They were actively engineering a legacy that would be handed down to their children and grandchildren, binding successive generations to the exact same coordinates of soil and water. With this demographic expansion came the absolute necessity of managing a complex social world of strangers, where hundreds of individuals had to live side by side without collapsing into internal conflict. In the ancient nomadic past, disputes within a wandering band were easily resolved by simply splitting the group and moving in separate directions across the open wilderness. But a permanent village, with its heavily invested infrastructure of irrigation canals, cleared fields, and mud brick homes, could not be abandoned over a simple quarrel. Humanity was forced to develop an entirely new social technology to preserve internal peace. The clear definition of property boundaries, the codification of customary laws, the establishment of neighborhood councils, and the recognition of formalized authority figures who could mediate disputes and enforce cooperation among households. The physical architecture of the home itself reflected this profound psychological shift. Houses became sturdier, utilizing uniform sun-dried mud bricks that provided insulation against the blistering heat of the day and the cold chill of the night. The open hearth at the center of the rectangular room became the warm anchor of family life, a place where stories were told, meals were shared, and the memories of the lineage were kept alive. The temporary, flexible arrangements of the ancient world were completely replaced by the rigid, durable geometry of the permanent village, transforming the human animal from a passive wanderer within nature into an active creator of a structured, humanized reality. The social fabric of these early communities was further strengthened by the shared, intergenerational labor required to maintain the village infrastructure. Every member of the household held a specific, recognized role within the collective economy. Men cleared fields and reinforced dikes, women ground grains and wove textiles, while children tended small herds of goats and carried fresh water from the water channels. This continuous, shared investment created a deep sense of permanent belonging, transforming the ancient nomadic concept of identity into an intense attachment to a specific town, a specific community, and a specific plot of earth. The bonds of permanence had been completely forged in the mud brick lanes of early Mesopotamia, establishing a lifestyle that would prove impossible to undo. As night settles completely over the ancient neighborhoods, the domestic hearth fires fade into soft, glowing embers inside the mud brick rooms. The tools of the field and the loom rest quietly against the insulated walls, and the families sleep peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they are surrounded by the protective embrace of their community. The long, exhausting eras of wandering have been left behind in the deep shadows of prehistory, and humanity has successfully found its permanent anchor in the ground. Let the profound, comforting weight of this ancient security wash over your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep and undisturbed sleep. As human communities bound themselves tightly to the soil, their spiritual imagination underwent an equally profound and majestic transformation, moving decisively away from the fluid animism of nomadic bands toward the structured worship of powerful, specialized deities. In a world where survival was now fully dependent on the success of a single harvest, the magnificent forces of nature, the sun that parched the earth, the wind that brought the sudden storms, and the rivers that delivered either life-giving silt or catastrophic destruction, took on a terrifying, deeply personal significance. To navigate this extreme vulnerability, the early settlers constructed small, dedicated shrines within their villages, simple mud brick rooms where families could present modest offerings of grain, dates, or livestock to appease the unseen powers that governed their earthly destiny. Over the course of generations, as the food surplus deepened and the population of the southern plains expanded with an unstoppable momentum, these humble village shrines underwent a spectacular architectural and social evolution. They rose higher and higher above the common houses, their massive walls constructed from millions of carefully stacked mud bricks, their corners aligned precisely with the cardinal points of the open heavens, and their outer facades painted a brilliant white to gleam magnificently under the unrelenting Mesopotamian sun. The temple was no longer just a small private room for quiet prayer. It had transformed into the absolute economic, political, and symbolic axis of the entire human community. Within its sacred inner chambers, a beautifully adorned statue of the city's patron deity was tended by a rising class of specialized priests, who bathed, clothed, and fed the divine image as though it were a living, breathing monarch. This early priesthood derived an immense, undisputed social power from their unique role as the exclusive intermediaries between humanity and the divine order, interpreting the complex patterns of the stars, the erratic movements of the rivers, and the arrival of sudden plagues for a population desperately seeking certainty. Crucially, the temple complex quickly evolved into the primary economic storehouse of the early state, a grand administrative center where surplus grain from the surrounding fields was systematically collected, recorded upon early clay tablets, and guarded against times of severe famine or military conflict. Those who controlled the altars and the storehouses held the very keys to collective survival, allowing the priesthood to establish a rigid, powerful social hierarchy that placed their sacred institution at the absolute summit of the community, casting a long, powerful shadow over every field, every hearth, and every human life across the plain. The physical growth of the temple precinct completely mirrored the rising complexity of Mesopotamian society, expanding from a single holy room into a vast, sprawling city within a city. Around the central platform, which would later evolve into the towering ziggurats of legend, lay a dense network of administrative offices, spacious bakeries, textile workshops, and deep storehouses, packed with the material wealth of the community. Here, early accountants used clay tokens to systematically track the incoming shipments of wheat, the number of sheep dedicated to sacrifice, and the hours of labor contributed by common citizens to the upkeep of the sacred walls. The temple had successfully fused the spiritual longing for cosmic order with the practical, material demands of a large civilization, turning devotion into a highly disciplined, efficient machine of social cohesion. This institutional structure provided the early proto-cities with an incredible resilience, allowing them to withstand natural disasters and internal social conflicts that would have shattered less organized communities. When the spring floods turned violent and washed away the lowland farms, it was the temple that unlocked its massive reserves to feed the hungry families, and it was the priesthood that organized the collective labor forces to rebuild the broken levees and clear the choked water channels. The common people saw the temple not merely as an expensive monument to the gods, but as a protective, living shield that stood firmly between their fragile lives and the chaotic forces of the natural world, reinforcing their absolute willingness to submit to its taxes, its rules, and its sacred authority. As the centuries advanced, the architectural scale of these religious structures became a competitive declaration of prestige and independence for each southern city, with Eridu, and Uruk each striving to build the grandest terrace for their chosen divine protector. The walls were decorated with elaborate mosaics made from colored clay cones pressed into the wet plaster, creating intricate geometric patterns that sparkled beautifully in the low light of evening torches. The sacred space was entirely separated from the mundane noise of the streets by high, thick enclosure walls, ensuring that those who entered the inner courtyards left behind the anxieties of the earth to step into an environment of absolute, rhythmic harmony and timeless permanence. As night drops its cool velvet blanket over the sacred city, the torches within the high temple courtyards are lowered to a soft, flickering glow. The priests have completed their evening chants, the heavy wooden doors of the storehouses are locked tight against the dark, and the statue of the god rests in the absolute silence of the inner sanctuary. The noise of the busy marketplaces and the heavy labor of the fields have completely vanished, leaving the white walls of the temple to stand as a silent, magnificent bridge between the stars above and the sleeping earth below. Let the profound, comforting weight of this sacred order settle into your mind, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the gradual accumulation of agricultural surplus, technological mastery, and institutional organization in the southern floodplains of Mesopotamia culminated in a spectacular explosion of human scale. The modest farming villages that had clung tightly to the edges of the irrigation channels were completely eclipsed by a new, towering phenomenon that would redefine the human experience forever: the arrival of the true metropolis. Foremost among these pristine centers of urban power was Uruk, a city that expanded with such a dramatic intensity that it became the absolute beating heart of the ancient Near East, transforming thousands of strangers into a single, highly disciplined civilizational unit. At its magnificent height, around 3200 BCE, Uruk was a marvel of sheer physical scale, covering over 250 hectares of land and housing an estimated population of 40,000 to 50,000 inhabitants. To a human race accustomed for millennia to living in tiny, isolated family bands of a few dozen individuals, stepping into Uruk must have felt like entering an entirely different reality. The city was wrapped in a massive, continuous defensive wall of baked mud brick that stretched for kilometers across the landscape, a monumental barrier that clearly separated the orderly space of urban life from the wild, unpredictable dangers of the open desert outside. Within these walls, the simple equality of the ancient tribal past was completely dissolved, replaced by a complex, highly stratified matrix of social classes, professional guilds, and specialized administrative roles. The physical layout of Uruk was meticulously structured to mirror this new social hierarchy, organized around two grand, independent temple districts that dominated the skyline. The Eanna district, dedicated to Inanna, the powerful goddess of love and war, and the Anu district, dedicated to the supreme sky god. These sacred precincts were filled with soaring platforms, vast colonnaded halls, and public courtyards decorated with millions of colored clay cones pressed into the wet plaster to form complex geometric mosaics. These were the true nerve centers of the metropolis, functioning simultaneously as holy sanctuaries, administrative headquarters, economic distribution hubs, and industrial workshops, where thousands of specialized craftsmen, weavers, and brewers labored daily under the direct supervision of the temple administration. This concentration of human labor and material wealth sparked a massive wave of technological innovation that completely transformed the nature of manufacturing and trade. The invention of the true potter's wheel allowed workshops to mass-produce uniform, utilitarian vessels on a scale never before imagined, leading to the creation of the famous beveled rim bowl, a standardized, coarsely made clay vessel used by administrators to distribute daily rations of barley and beer to the vast armies of state laborers. Metalworkers advanced from cold hammering raw copper to melting and casting the metal in sophisticated molds, producing durable tools, weapons, and luxury items that were highly prized across the ancient world. Uruk's economic influence expanded aggressively outward, establishing a vast network of trading colonies and outposts that stretched deep into the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of Iran, creating the world's first economic world system. Managing an enterprise of this immense global scale, however, placed an unprecedented strain on the traditional limits of human memory and face-to-face communication. An administrator standing in the central storehouses of the Eanna district could no longer personally memorize how many thousands of grain bushels had been collected from hundreds of different fields, nor could he remember which specific herdsman had delivered their required quota of wool for the textile workshops. The loose, informal agreements of the village past were entirely inadequate for the administrative demands of a metropolis. To prevent the massive economic engine of Uruk from collapsing into utter chaos and corruption, humanity stood on the absolute verge of its most brilliant, radical leap forward, an intellectual breakthrough that would turn the fragile, passing human voice into a physical, permanent anchor of absolute certainty across time. The streets of the great city were a vibrant, noisy tapestry of life, where merchants argued over prices, carts laden with timber rumbled past, and foreign traders displayed exotic stones from distant lands. Yet, as the blinding sun dipped below the massive brick horizons, a profound sense of order and security took hold of the neighborhoods. The workers returned to their simple, mud-brick homes. The fires of the metal furnaces were banked for the night, and the immense city walls cast long, protective shadows over the silent lanes. The chaos of human density had been successfully tamed by institutional discipline, leaving the white temples to glow softly under the emerging stars, a testament to a species that had learned to build a collective world out of the raw clay of the earth. As you rest quietly under the covers tonight, visualize the towering walls and silent, grand districts of ancient Uruk, resting peacefully beneath a vast canopy of stars. The heavy wooden gates of the city are barred tight, the busy marketplaces are completely empty, and the great temples stand as silent sentinels over tens of thousands of sleeping souls. The intense energy of the world's first metropolis has softened into a deep, soothing stillness that fills every courtyard and every street. Let the profound, comforting weight of this urban stability wash over your mind, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep and undisturbed sleep. The immense administrative pressures of Uruk's global trade networks eventually forced human intelligence to shatter its most ancient cognitive barrier. For hundreds of thousands of years, the preservation of human culture, historical memory, and economic agreements had depended entirely on the fragile, passing mechanism of oral storytelling and face-to-face communication. If a storyteller died without a successor, an entire epic vanished from the earth. If an accountant forgot a verbal contract, an entire economic relationship collapsed into bitter dispute. In the busy, crowded storehouses of the southern plains, where millions of tons of agricultural assets moved daily through the hands of a few temple officials, the absolute limits of human memory were finally reached, demanding the creation of an entirely new system of permanent tracking. The long path toward this cognitive revolution began simply using small, geometric clay tokens that had been utilized by Near Eastern accountants for thousands of years to track livestock and grain. A single clay cone might represent a specific measure of barley, while a small clay sphere designated a single sheep from the communal herd. To ensure that these loose tokens were not lost, altered, or stolen during long-distance trade journeys, accountants began to seal them inside hollow, spherical clay balls known to modern archaeology as bullae. However, because the tokens were completely hidden inside the hardened clay shells, an official at the destination could not easily verify the contents without breaking the container open, which destroyed the seal of authenticity. To resolve this practical limitation, early clerks began to press the sharp geometric tokens into the wet outer surface of the hollow balls before sealing them inside, leaving behind a clear, permanent physical imprint of the hidden assets. It did not take long for the brilliant, pragmatic minds of the Uruk administration to realize a profound shortcut. If the physical imprint on the outside of the clay ball already perfectly communicated the exact number of sheep or bags of grain, the physical tokens inside were completely redundant. The hollow clay balls were quickly discarded, replaced by flat, solid clay tablets where numbers and early pictographic symbols could be drawn directly onto the soft, wet surface using a sharpened reed stylus harvested from the riverbanks. At first, this primitive recording system was entirely pictographic, utilizing simple, direct drawings of objects to represent the physical world. A drawing of a bull's head represented cattle, a jagged line signified flowing water, and a small picture of a bowl marked a standard ration of food. But a purely pictographic script possessed severe structural limitations, as it could only represent concrete, material objects and could not easily capture abstract ideas, complex actions, or grammatical nuances. Over centuries of intense, daily refinement in the temple schools, these crude pictures were systematically simplified, abstracted, and turned 90 degrees to increase the speed of the scribes, transforming from recognizable images into groups of abstract, wedge-shaped signs known as cuneiform. The true, definitive breakthrough occurred when scribes began to decouple the symbols from the physical objects themselves, attaching the wedge-shaped signs instead to the specific phonetic sounds of the spoken human language. A sign was no longer just a picture of an object. It was a syllable, a sound, a building block of speech that could be combined with other signs to write any word, any thought, any abstract prayer, or ein complex legal contract. Writing had officially crossed the threshold from a primitive accounting ledger to become a flexible, universal instrument of human expression, allowing the thoughts of a single mind to be frozen in clay, preserved across generations, and read by individuals thousands of miles and thousands of years removed from the writer. This newfound capability fundamentally transformed the nature of power, law, and human continuity across the Mesopotamian plain, giving birth to a highly specialized class of elite scribes who managed the daily affairs of the emerging state. Royal decrees could be sent across vast distances with the absolute certainty that the king's precise words would be read without a single alteration. Legal contracts could be signed with the wet imprints of cylinder seals to prevent any future fraud, and the terrifying laws of the land could be etched permanently into stone pillars for all to see. The fragile, passing human voice had been completely conquered, replaced by an unyielding script that could preserve memory, celebrate the glorious deeds of kings, and keep a meticulous, mathematical record of every grain of sand and every drop of water across the cultivated world. As night darkens the quiet archives of the ancient cities, the clay tablets are stacked systematically upon wooden shelves, drying slowly in the cool evening air. The scribes have cleaned their reed styluses and left the courtyards, leaving the newly inscribed symbols to stand in absolute silence under the watchful light of the stars. The names of forgotten kings, the boundaries of ancient fields, and the sacred prayers of long-dead priests rest secure within the hardened earth, waiting patiently to speak their truths to future ages. Let the profound, comforting certainty of this immortal script settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a peaceful and undisturbed sleep. As the 4th millennium BCE gracefully gave way to the 3rd, the political landscape of southern Mesopotamia underwent another profound and highly dramatic reorganization. The vast, centralized authority that had allowed a single metropolis like Uruk to dominate the entire regional trade network began to fracture, giving rise to an era of intense rivalry and fragmented power known to modern history as the early dynastic period. Across the flat alluvial plains, separate independent city-states, Lagash, Kish, Umma, and Nippur, hardened their borders, expanded their defensive networks, and vied aggressively for dominance over the shared resources of the earth. The ancient dominance of the temple administration, which had managed society through spiritual consensus and economic distribution, was no longer sufficient to protect communities in this new, highly volatile environment of peer-state competition. In this atmosphere of continuous territorial friction, where a single blocked irrigation canal upstream could spell immediate starvation for a city downstream, a completely new type of leader emerged to dominate human affairs. The Lugal. The word itself comes from the ancient Sumerian terms Lu for man and Gal for great, translating literally to the great man or the warlord king. Unlike the traditional En, or high priest, whose authority was rooted deeply in the peaceful management of the temple estates and the performance of sacred rituals, the Lugal derived his rising power from physical strength, military strategy, and his proven ability to defend the city gates from aggressive neighbors. What began as a temporary emergency office granted by the communal assembly during times of severe conflict quickly transformed into a permanent, lifelong position of absolute political and military authority. As these warlords consolidated their power, they systematically separated themselves from the ancient temple precincts, constructing massive, heavily fortified palace complexes that stood as proud, independent rivals to the sacred ziggurats. This structural separation marked the birth of a distinct secular state, where the palace managed the standing armies, enforced judicial laws, collected civic taxes, and directed foreign diplomacy, while the temple focused on the spiritual maintenance of the cosmic order. To ensure that their hard-earned authority survived their own mortality, these early kings established the concept of hereditary dynasty, decreeing that the right to rule was an inherent, sacred blood right that passed automatically from father to son, anchoring the political future of the city within the longevity of a single royal lineage. The rise of kingship completely transformed the nature of warfare and social organization across the Mesopotamian plain, turning loose tribal skirmishes into highly disciplined, industrial-scale operations. The famous Stele of the Vultures, a magnificent stone monument recovered from the ruins of Lagash, provides a vivid, cinematic record of this new military reality, depicting King Eannatum leading a dense phalanx of heavily armed soldiers into battle against their bitter rivals from the city of Umma. The soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder under a continuous shield wall, their spears thrust forward with an absolute, terrifying precision, trampling over the fallen bodies of their enemies. War was no longer a random act of passion, but a highly organized tool of state policy, used to seize territory, capture foreign slaves, and secure the vital water rights that sustained the wealth of the kingdom. Inside the royal palaces, a sophisticated court culture emerged to celebrate the glory and the divine legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. Scribes were commissioned to compose the Sumerian king list, a grand ideological document that traced the origin of kingship back to the absolute beginning of time, declaring that the royal office had literally descended from heaven to reside within the chosen cities of the plain. Exquisite artisans created magnificent jewelry, polished gold daggers, and beautiful musical harps, adorned with the heads of bulls, to decorate the royal chambers, creating a visual language of absolute wealth and power that left common citizens and foreign ambassadors in a state of complete, unquestioning awe. The ultimate, most haunting expression of this early dynastic power was discovered by modern archaeology within the royal tombs of Ur, where King Meschalamdug and Queen Puabi were laid to rest beneath the earth around 2600 BCE. Within these deep, stone-lined chambers, excavators uncovered not only a spectacular treasure of gold crowns, silver vessels, and precious blue lapis lazuli, but the silent, orderly remains of entire royal retinues who had followed their monarchs into the afterlife. Dozens of court ladies dressed in fine crimson wool, royal bodyguards still clutching their bronze weapons, and stable drivers with their oxen carts lay arranged in perfect, peaceful alignment on the tomb floor. They had consumed a lethal, quiet narcotic from small clay cups, choosing to fall asleep permanently alongside their rulers to serve them in the eternal realms. A chilling and profound testament to an era where the authority of the king was considered absolute, divine, and completely unbroken by death itself. As the quiet hand of midnight strokes the ancient palaces of Sumer, the heavy bronze gates of the royal quarters are closed and barred by the palace guard. The brilliant gold crowns and polished weapons have been laid aside. The court poets have silenced their lyres, and the great warlord kings rest in the deep quiet of their private chambers. The intense, bloody rivalries of the day have faded into a temporary, peaceful truce beneath the vast, indifferent wheel of the stars, leaving the massive brick walls of the palace to guard the destiny of the lineage through the dark hours. Let the profound, comforting stability of this ancient order settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a peaceful and undisturbed sleep. The inevitable consequence of a growing population and a limited supply of fertile land was the arrival of organized, territorial warfare. For generations, the independent city-states of the southern plain had managed to coexist by expanding their internal canal networks and pushing their borders outward into the empty desert. But by 2500 BCE, the empty spaces between the kingdoms had completely vanished, forcing neighboring cities into a direct, volatile friction over the exact same patches of soil and water. The most famous, meticulously documented, and enduring of these early geopolitical rivalries unfolded between the twin city-states of Lagash and Umar, who spent over 150 years locked in a bitter, bloody struggle for control of a single fertile border territory known as the Gu Edin. The Gu Edin, whose name translates literally to the edge of the plain, was a remarkably lush, highly productive tract of agricultural land that lay precisely between the borders of Lagash and Umar. Fed by a network of shared canals linked directly to the main channel of the Euphrates River, this territory was capable of producing immense surpluses of barley, wheat, and valuable flax, making it the ultimate economic prize for whichever city could successfully assert its exclusive sovereignty over the soil. The conflict began in earnest when the ambitious king of Umar deliberately breached the ancient border stones that had been established generations earlier by a neutral arbitrator, marching his armies into the Guedin, destroying the irrigation channels of Lagash, and seizing the harvest for his own city storehouses. This aggressive move was a direct challenge to the pride, the economic survival, and the religious honor of Lagash, provoking an immediate and massive military response from its newly crowned warlord king, Eonatum. Gathering a highly disciplined force of citizens, Eonatum marched out to meet the invaders in the open fields of the Guedin, deploying a revolutionary tactical formation that would dominate the battlefields of Southwest Asia for centuries, the heavy infantry phalanx. Clad in thick leather cloaks reinforced with heavy bronze studs, the soldiers of Lagash stood shoulder to shoulder in a continuous, impenetrable wall of overlapping shields, their long spears thrust forward with a calculated, terrifying precision that completely broke the disorganized lines of the Umar militia. The spectacular victory of Lagash was captured permanently for future generations upon the fragments of the Stele of the Vultures, a magnificent limestone monument that stands as the world's oldest surviving historical narrative and war memorial. On its carved surfaces, we see a cinematic and brutal depiction of the aftermath of the battle. Flocks of vultures and fierce lions tearing at the severed heads and limbs of the defeated soldiers of Umma, while the victorious troops of Lagash march forward in perfect, rhythmic triumph under the protective wings of Ningirsu, the great storm god of the city. Enetum did not merely expel the invaders, he forced the defeated leadership of Umma to sign a formal, binding treaty etched into the stone, swearing by the great gods of heaven that they would never again cross the border canal or touch a single grain of the Guedin without paying a crushing annual tribute to Lagash. Yet, this hard-earned peace was a fragile, fleeting illusion, as successive generations of Umma kings refused to accept their permanent humiliation and waited patiently for any sign of weakness in Lagash to strike back. Over the course of 150 years, the border stones were broken and replanted dozens of times. Canals were repeatedly dug to drain the water from rival fields, and the soil of the Guedin was soaked with the blood of thousands of common farmers who were called away from their ploughs to defend the territorial ambitions of their respective palaces. This continuous cycle of warfare placed a tremendous strain on the internal social structures of both city-states, gradually hollowing out their financial reserves, increasing the tax burdens on ordinary citizens, and setting the stage for a radical domestic revolution within the walls of Lagash itself. As the long decades of conflict dragged on, the nature of the rivalry shifted from external defense to absolute economic exhaustion, forcing both cities to dedicate their entire industrial capacity to the manufacturing of bronze weapons, the construction of heavy war chariots, and the maintenance of expensive standing armies. The common people grew deeply weary of the constant levies, the loss of their sons in distant skirmishes, and the rising power of a military elite that took more and more of the annual harvest for the defense of the state. The Guedin, which had been designed to be a fountain of life-giving abundance, had transformed into a monument of human stubbornness and rivalry, proving to the emerging world that the accumulation of wealth would always bring the absolute certainty of violence and competition. As night falls completely over the contested fields of the Guedin, a deep, heavy stillness settles over the ancient border dikes and quiet canals. The armies have withdrawn behind the massive brick walls of their respective cities, the vultures have finished their grim work, and the stars look down with absolute indifference upon the dark, fertile earth below. The broken border stones stand like silent ghosts in the moonlight, waiting for the arrival of the next spring floods and the inevitable return of human ambition. Let the profound, comforting quiet of this peaceful night wash over your consciousness, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The unyielding drain of the generational border war with Umma eventually pushed the domestic social fabric of Lagash to the absolute point of collapse. To maintain a massive standing army, manufacture bronze weapons, and fortify the city walls, the ruling dynasties had systematically expanded the weight of the state bureaucracy, creating an intricate web of tax collectors, overseers, and palace officials who infiltrated every corner of daily life. This bloated administrative class quickly grew corrupt, exploiting the continuous state of military emergency to seize the private property of ordinary citizens, impose extortionate fees on holy rituals, and reduce the common labourers to a state of desperate, grinding poverty within their own city walls. By 2400 BCE, the corruption in Lagash had become an insufferable plague that spared neither the living nor the dead. Palace inspectors routinely confiscated the finest oxen from working farmers under the pretext of war taxes. Inspectors controlled the fishing fleets along the canals to demand a massive cut of every catch, and the high priests of the temple charged such exorbitant fees for simple burial rituals that grieving families were forced to give up their ancestral lands just to lay their loved ones to rest in the earth. The ancient contract between the rulers and the ruled was completely broken, replaced by an abusive system where the rich and powerful preyed upon the absolute vulnerability of the widow, the orphan, and the common labourer without a single shred of remorse or judicial oversight. In this atmosphere of profound social unrest, a radical leader named Urukagina seized the royal throne through a popular coup, backed by the intense fury of the common people and the support of reform-minded segments of the old priesthood. Upon taking power, Urukagina did something entirely unprecedented in the history of human governance. He did not use his new authority to accumulate personal wealth or launch aggressive wars against foreign neighbors, but instead turned his energy inward to dismantle the corrupt machinery of the state. He commissioned a series of monumental clay cones, etched with a sweeping text that modern historians recognize as the world's first formal declaration of human rights, social justice, and legal equality before the law. The famous Urukagina Liberty Cones detail a spectacular and immediate sweeping reform of the entire socio-economic landscape of Lagash, written in a clear, uncompromising tone of absolute moral authority. The new king formally dismissed the corrupt tax collectors from the ports and fields, abolished the unfair fees on religious and funeral ceremonies, and returned the lands that had been illegally seized by greedy palace officials to their original civilian owners. He explicitly decreed that the wealthy could no longer use their economic leverage to force a poor man to sell his house or his livestock at an unfair price, stating with absolute clarity that he had been placed upon the throne by Ningersu, the city god, specifically to ensure that the powerful could never again oppress the weak, the widow, and the fatherless child. Crucially, within this extensive legal text appears the absolute first written use of the abstract concept of human freedom in any language on earth, expressed through the beautiful Sumerian word amagi, which translates literally to a return to the mother. To Urukagina and the citizens of Lagash, liberty was not a dangerous, modern innovation, but a sacred restoration of the primordial cosmic order, a gentle return to the natural harmony that had existed before human greed and state corruption had distorted the world. This legal code was more than a set of practical regulations. It was a profound intellectual milestone that established the permanent principle that governance must be anchored to an unyielding standard of absolute justice, fairness, and moral responsibility toward the humblest members of the human community. Yet, the radical domestic reforms of Urukagina ultimately carried a heavy, tragic, geopolitical price within the highly competitive arena of the early dynastic period. By focusing his limited resources on social justice, internal welfare, and the dismantling of the military bureaucratic elite, the idealistic king inadvertently weakened the external defense mechanisms and collective readiness of the state of Lagash. Seeing his ancient rival deeply absorbed in internal restructuring and social experiments, an ambitious, ruthlessly pragmatic warlord from the neighboring city-state of Umma, named Lugalshagasi, saw a golden opportunity to strike a definitive, fatal blow against the city that had humiliated his ancestors for over a century. Lugalshagesi did not merely dream of border skirmishes or seizing individual fields in the Guedin. He calculated the absolute destruction of Lagash itself, gathering a massive, professional army to march across the dikes and lay siege to the city gates. The internal reforms of Urukagina could not stop the brutal momentum of a highly organized foreign invasion, and around 2350 BCE, the walls of Lagash were breached, its beautiful white temples were plundered, and the world's first social reformer vanished from the pages of history, leaving his broken liberty cones buried deep within the burning ruins of his city, a poignant reminder of the eternal, delicate balance between internal justice and external survival. As the deep silence of midnight blankets the ancient, ruined mounds of Lagash, the smoke of the long-ago fires has cleared away, leaving only the cold clay fragments of history buried beneath the shifting sands of the Iraqi desert. The kings, the corrupt inspectors, and the common laborers who shouted for their freedom have all dissolved into the identical, indifferent dust of the plain, but the words they etched into the wet clay amagi remain completely indestructible, floating across the centuries with a persistent, brilliant clarity. Let the comforting weight of this timeless quest for universal justice settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The brutal destruction of Lagash was not a random act of local vengeance, but the first calculated step in a grand, unprecedented political project designed to fundamentally reshape the map of the ancient Near East. For centuries, the southern plains of Mesopotamia had been locked in a fragmented, exhausting cycle of peer-state competition, where independent city-states squandered their immense wealth and human resources fighting over the exact same border dikes and irrigation channels. Lugal-Zaggisi, the ambitious and ruthlessly pragmatic warlord who had risen to the throne of Umma, looked across the fractured landscape of Sumer and envisioned an entirely new structure of human power, the creation of a unified, regional state that brought all the independent kingdoms under the absolute sovereignty of a single ruler. After his decisive and bloody victory over Urukagina of Lagash, Lugal-Zaggisi did not return quietly to his capital at Umma to enjoy his spoils. Instead, he marched his veteran infantry phalanxes westward, launching a lightning military campaign that struck directly at the oldest and most prestigious urban centers of the plain. One by one, the ancient city-states, Kish, Ur, Larsa, and Nippur, fell before the unstoppable, highly disciplined momentum of his armies. Uruk, the magnificent metropolis of the 4th millennium, was breached and captured. But rather than plundering its sacred precincts, Lugal-Zaggisi made a brilliant, strategic political choice. He moved his entire royal court to Uruk, declaring it the grand capital of his new, expanded realm and adopting the ancient, highly revered title of King of Uruk. By consolidating these separate principalities under his absolute authority, Lugal-Zaggisi effectively brought an end to the destructive early dynastic period, replacing centuries of local rivalries with a centralized, imperial peace. On a series of magnificent, hollow stone vases dedicated to the supreme god Enlil at the sacred city of Nippur, the triumphant monarch left behind a sweeping, poetic inscription that marks the absolute birth of imperial ideology. In these beautifully preserved cuneiform lines, he proudly boasts that Enlil had given him the kingship over all the lands of Sumer, making the rivers flow with abundance, turning the deserts into orchards, and causing the entire population of the plains to rest in absolute, undisturbed security under his protective scepter. The geopolitical ambitions of the new emperor, however, stretched far beyond the narrow, muddy borders of the southern delta. Lugal-Zaggisi claimed in his inscriptions that his power extended from the lower sea to the upper sea, meaning from the warm waters of the Persian Gulf all the way across the vast deserts to the distant Mediterranean coast. While this grand statement likely represented an early form of royal exaggeration rather than direct permanent military occupation, it reflected a profound, revolutionary shift in human consciousness. Rulers were no longer content to merely defend their local city walls or secure a single agricultural field like the Guedin. They were beginning to imagine a universal empire, a global dominion where all nations, languages, and trading routes were bound to the absolute will of a single, centralized palace. To maintain this unprecedented scale of governance, Lugal-Zaggisi systematically reorganized the administrative infrastructure of the plain, replacing the traditional, independent city governors with his own loyal military officers and trusted court officials. The temple storehouses, which had historically operated as localized community centers, were integrated into a wider, regional network of distribution, allowing the central palace at Uruk to direct resources, conscript labor force, and moving supplies across hundreds of miles, with an unprecedented mathematical efficiency. The independent identity of the ancient Sumerian city-states was quietly dissolving into a larger, unified civilizational identity, setting a structural blueprint that would permanently alter the scale of political ambition across the ancient world. Yet, the grand regional empire constructed by Lugal-Zaggisi was built upon a fragile, highly volatile foundation of military coercion and deep local resentment. The proud ancient families of cities like Ur and Kish deeply loathed their sudden subjugation to a foreign conqueror from Umma, viewing the imperial overseers as greedy occupiers who drained their local wealth to beautify the palaces of Uruk. This internal instability meant that the empire required the constant, exhausting presence of the emperor's standing armies to suppress whispers of rebellion, leaving the northern frontiers of the plain dangerously exposed to the arrival of new, dynamic forces. Lugal-Zaggisi had successfully demonstrated that Sumer could be unified by the sword, but he had also inadvertently prepared the ground for a completely different kind of conqueror, a brilliant, legendary outsider from the north, who would soon dismantle the Sumerian world entirely, to build an empire that truly redefined the limits of the earth. As the quiet hand of midnight sweeps across the high terraces of unified Uruk, the massive bronze bars are secured across the city gates, and the imperial guards pace the high walls in the cool evening air. The great emperor Lugal-Zaggisi rests within his guarded palace chambers, his gold scepter lying silent beside his bed, completely confident that his universal peace will endure through the ages. The quiet waters of the Euphrates flow softly past the brick foundations, reflecting the timeless light of the stars that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless human dreams. Let the profound, comforting weight of this ancient stillness settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a peaceful and undisturbed sleep. The dramatic collapse of Lugal-Zaggisi's regional coalition did not mark the end of Sargon's geopolitical ambitions, but rather the true, definitive opening chapter of an imperial enterprise that would completely redefine the geographic scale of human organization. For millennia, the independent city-states of Mesopotamia had measured their power by the narrow boundaries of localized river channels and the immediate security of their defensive city walls. Sargon, now styling himself the supreme ruler of Akkad, looked far beyond the flat alluvial plains of Sumer and conceived an entirely new structure of universal dominion, a multinational, multi-ethnic empire that would swallow separate nations, distinct languages, and ancient trading routes into a single, centralized system of absolute power. Having thoroughly subjugated the ancient southern cities of Uruk, Lagash, and Sargon performed a deeply symbolic ritual that sent shockwaves through the ancient Near East. He marched his victorious army to the edge of the Persian Gulf and ceremonially washed his bronze weapons in the warm salt waters of the Lower Sea. This dramatic act was not a simple display of military theatre. It was a profound declaration to the known world that the entire length of the Tigris and the Euphrates valleys, from the northern mountains to the southern marshes, was now under the unyielding sovereignty of a single, unified palace. But the trade networks that sustained the luxury economy of his new capital at Akkad required raw materials, hard timber, structural stone, and precious metals that the muddy, wood-starved plains of Mesopotamia simply could not provide. To secure these vital resources, Sargon turned his highly mobile, bow-armed military machine outward, launching a series of aggressive, long-range campaigns that struck deep into the surrounding highlands. He marched his veteran units northwest, along the sweeping curve of the Euphrates River, breaching and capturing the rich trading metropolis of Mari, before advancing into the ancient kingdom of Ebla in modern-day Syria. His armies pushed continuously forward through the dense cedar forests of the Amarnas Mountains, where his loggers felled giant trees to be floated hundreds of miles downstream to fuel the construction projects of Akkad, and penetrated the craggy, metal-rich ridges of the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, securing direct control over the primary silver mines of the ancient world. Sargon's spectacular inscriptions proudly claim that the supreme god Dagon had granted him exclusive dominion over the upper land, allowing his authority to stretch unimpeded from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean coast. For the first time in the human story, a single individual held the power to issue a royal decree that would be read and obeyed simultaneously by Sumerian-speaking administrators in the southern delta, Semitic-speaking merchants in the northern plains, and Hurrian-speaking tribesmen in the distant mountain passes. Sargon had successfully transformed warfare from a tool of local border adjustments into an instrument of universal integration, turning a collection of fiercely independent peoples into a vast, interdependent imperial economy that functioned as a single civilizational machine. To maintain this unprecedented, far-flung dominion, Sargon pioneered a revolutionary administrative technique that permanently shattered the ancient aristocratic framework of the city-state, the establishment of a centralized, professional bureaucracy loyal exclusively to the crown. He systematically dismantled the traditional local dynasties, replacing the proud, independent city governors with his own highly trusted Akkadian military officers, administrative clerks, and family members. These imperial overseers, known to history as the Sons of Akkad, managed the collection of local taxes, supervised the clearing of vital regional canals, and directed the flow of grain, wool, and oil toward the central storehouses of the capital, ensuring that the local wealth of every conquered territory was funneled directly into the aggrandizement of the imperial center. Sargon also realized that physical coercion alone could never permanently hold a multinational empire together without a shared language of value and a unified cultural narrative. He decreed that Akkadian, his native Semitic tongue, would serve as the official language of imperial administration, forcing scribes from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean to learn his speech and adopt his standardized accounting practices. He integrated the ancient, prestigious religious traditions of the Sumerian south with the dynamic cults of the Semitic north, mapping the Sumerian goddess Inanna onto his native Ishtar and creating a unified pantheon that provided a profound sense of cosmic legitimacy to his earthly rule. Sargon had successfully demonstrated that an empire could not be managed by the sword alone. It required the creation of a universal administrative infrastructure that bound the minds, the resources, and the daily habits of millions of strangers to the absolute rhythm of a single palace. As the quiet hand of midnight blankets the vast, unified expanses of the Akkadian world, the campfires at the distant frontier outposts burn steady and slow under the velvet sky. The great Emperor Sargon rests within his magnificent palace at Akkad, surrounded by the tribute of a dozen separate nations, gold from the mountains, cedar from the forests, and lapis lazuli from the deep east. The ancient rivalries of local city dykes have been completely swallowed by the immense, quiet weight of a global peace that stretches across the face of the earth. Let the profound, comforting stability of this immense civilizational triumph settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. While Sargon's professional bureaucracy and light infantry skirmishers could physically conquer the proud city-states of the south, physical coercion alone was entirely insufficient to bridge the deep cultural and religious divide that threatened to tear his new empire apart. The conquered Sumerians looked upon their Semitic-speaking rulers from the north as uncultured outsiders, viewing the imperial overseers as greedy occupiers who defiled the ancient traditions of the plain. To prevent his universal kingdom from collapsing into an immediate, bloody civil war, the great emperor realized he needed an intellectual breakthrough that could weave the souls of both nations into a single, unified, spiritual tapestry. To achieve this monumental task, Sargon turned to his brilliant daughter, a woman whose name would echo down through the millennia as the world's very first recorded author in human history, Enheduanna. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon made a masterstroke of political and religious strategy, appointing his daughter, Enheduanna, to the supreme position of High Priestess of Nanna, the deeply revered Sumerian moon god, at his sacred temple in the ancient southern city of Her name was not a simple birth name, but a sacred title, translating literally to the High Priestess, who is the ornament of heaven. By placing his own flesh and blood at the absolute summit of the oldest, the most prestigious religious institution in Sumer, Sargon effectively decapitated the traditional southern priesthood that had long fueled anti-Akkadian rebellions. But Enheduanna was far more than a passive political tool or a royal figurehead. She was a deeply spiritual intellectual, a master astronomer, and a poet of unmatched brilliance who would completely transform the nature of worship and language across the Near East. Living within the high, thick walls of the temple precinct at Enheduanna dedicated her long nights to observing the changing cycles of the moon, calculating the movements of the stars, and composition of a magnificent body of literature that would bind the empire together. Her greatest masterpiece, The Sumerian temple hymns was a collection of 42 deeply poetic songs dedicated to the distinct sanctuaries and patron deities of every major city-state across the plain, from Eridu in the deep south to Akkad in the far north. Through these beautifully structured verses, she performed a profound act of spiritual integration, systematically mapping the ancient Sumerian gods onto their Semitic counterparts, and weaving 42 separate municipal traditions into a single, unified national pantheon that provided a profound sense of cosmic legitimacy to her father's earthly rule. Most remarkably, Enheduanna did something that no storyteller, priest, or scribe had ever dared to do in all the thousands of years of human history. She explicitly signed her own name to the wet clay tablets, permanently claiming individual authorship over her creative work. In her highly personal and intensely emotional poem, The Exaltation of Inanna, she vividly describes the exhausting psychological process of literary creation, comparing the writing of a hymn to a spiritual birth, stating that she stayed awake, night after night, shifting her awareness from the deep silence of her chamber to give birth to a song that would survive her own mortality. By writing herself into the text, she broke the ancient tradition of anonymous scribe craft, establishing the permanent principle that a piece of literature is the sacred property of the individual mind that forged it, and lifting the human artist into a shared consciousness that crossed the boundaries of time. Her writing was exceptionally sophisticated, utilizing complex metaphors, rich psychological insights, and an uncompromising tone of absolute moral authority that left generations of future scribes in a state of complete, unquestioning awe. For centuries after her death, her hymns were copied, studied, and memorized by student clerks in the tablet schools of Babylon and Assyria, serving as the ultimate standard of classical literature, grammar, and poetic composition across the ancient world. She had successfully demonstrated that an empire could not be sustained by the sword alone. It required a beautiful, universal cultural language that could give voice to the deepest longings, fears, and spiritual aspirations of millions of strangers living under a single crown. Yet, her long, dedicated life of sacred service was suddenly disrupted by a violent political rebellion that erupted in the south, led by a conservative Sumerian nobleman named Lugal-An, who sought to purge the Akkadian ruling class from the city of Lugal-An invaded the temple precinct, stripped Enheduanna of her high offices, and drove her into a harsh, humiliating exile in the open wilderness outside the city walls. In her desperate vulnerability, wandering through the scorched sands under the indifferent light of the stars, she turned back to her ultimate weapon, the written word composing a fierce, heart-wrenching prayer to Inanna that begged the goddess of war to descend and crush the usurper who had violated the sacred boundaries of her sanctuary. Sargon's military forces eventually marched down to suppress the rebellion, restoring the princess-priestess to her rightful place upon the altar of Nanna, a triumphant vindication that proved to the emerging world that the immortal power of a poet's voice could outlast the crude iron willpower of any tyrant. As the quiet hand of midnight blankets the high ziggurat of ancient the torches within the sacred inner courtyards flicker low and steady under the silver moonlight. The high priestess Enheduanna has laid down her reed stylus, her deep, rhythmic breathing filling the quiet spaces of her private room as she rests peacefully after a long night of cosmic observation and composition. The noise of the political rebellions and the busy marketplaces has completely dissolved, leaving the newly inscribed clay tablets to stand as silent, magnificent bridges between the shifting emotions of the earth and the timeless harmony of the stars above. Let the profound, comforting certainty of this immortal literature settle deep into your thoughts, letting the slow, steady rhythm of history carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The spectacular multinational empire, forged by the sheer willpower of Sargon the Great, reached its absolute pinnacle of material wealth and political dominance under his brilliant grandson, Naram-Sin. Ruling around 2250 BCE, Naram-Sin did something that no leader before him had ever dared to attempt. He declared himself not merely a representative of the divine order, but a living god on earth, ordering artists to depict him, wearing the sacred horned helmet of the deities and adopting the magnificent title of King of the Four Quarters of the world. Under his unyielding rule, the capital city of Akkad overflowed with an unimaginable tribute sent from the distant corners of the earth: gold from Anatolia, cedar from the Mediterranean, and exotic animals from the deep east. Yet, beneath this glittering surface of absolute triumph lay a profound structural vulnerability, a fragile dependence on military coercion and environmental stability that was preparing to plunge the First World Empire into an apocalyptic chaos. According to later, deeply evocative Mesopotamian literary traditions, preserved on a famous series of clay tablets known as the Curse of Agade, the catastrophic downfall of the empire was caused by an act of absolute, overweening hubris committed by the deified king Naram-Sin. The legend records that when the supreme god Enlil withdrew his sacred favor from the capital city of Akkad, refusing to grant his divine blessings to the royal palace, the frustrated monarch fell into a deep, destructive rage that completely clouded his judgment. In an act of ultimate defiance, Naram-Sin marched his standing army to the sacred city of Nippur and systematically plundered the Akur, the holy, age-old temple of Enlil, smashing its beautifully adorned sanctuaries, melting down its gold vessels, and tearing up its foundations with heavy copper axes as though it were a conquered foreign citadel. The spiritual shockwave of this sacrilege provoked an immediate, terrifying retribution from the cosmic powers that governed the plane. To avenge the desecration of his holy house, Enlil looked far beyond the mountain passes of the eastern frontier and summoned the Gutians, a fierce, highly mobile group of mountain nomads who descended from the Zagros ridges like a sudden, unstoppable locust plague across the fields. Modern scientific research reveals a deeper, equally dramatic catalyst for this imperial collapse: a sudden, severe, global climate shift that brought decades of intense, catastrophic drought to Southwest Asia, drying up the northern tributaries, halting the flow of the vital irrigation canals, and plunging the heavily populated southern cities into a state of absolute, grinding starvation that the centralized bureaucracy of Akkad simply could not manage or resolve. The combination of ecological devastation, internal rebellions from proud southern cities like Ur and Uruk, and the continuous, destructive raids of the Gutian tribesmen completely broke the political unity of the empire within a single generation after Naram-Sin's death. The grand administrative network that had successfully funneled the wealth of a dozen separate nations toward the imperial center dissolved into utter chaos, leaving the proud capital of Akkad isolated, defenseless, and completely vulnerable to its enemies. Around 2150 BCE, the city was breached, its magnificent palaces were burned to the ground, and its walls were systematically leveled, an absolute and permanent destruction so thorough that the exact geographical location of Akkad was completely erased from human memory, buried forever beneath the silent sands of the Iraqi desert. Yet, as the grand Akkadian imperial project crumbled back into the raw mud from which it had rose, the ancient, resilient traditions of the Mesopotamian plain did not perish with the dynasty. The independent city-states of the south emerged from the shadow of the empire to reclaim their ancient heritage, embarking on a magnificent cultural and political renaissance, organized around their traditional temple institutions and localized water management networks. In the quiet courtyards of cities like Lagash and Ur, new leaders stepped forward to rebuild the broken canals, replant the sacred boundary stones, and restore the beautiful, wedge-shaped cuneiform script to its original task of tracking the golden harvests of the earth, proving to the emerging world that while individual empires are fragile and fleeting, the fundamental structures of human cooperation, intelligence, and permanence are completely indestructible. The 20-part historical journey that began with the quiet confidence of the first nomadic bands choosing to drop their heavy traveling packs by the pristine riverbanks has brought us across thousands of years of human ambition, technological mastery, and political transformation. We have watched humanity learn to turn raw mud into permanent homes, to selective breed the wild animals, to create an immortal script that can conquer the passing human voice, and to construct soaring ziggurats and massive metropolises that declared their identity to the stars. The names of Sargon, Enheduanna, Urukagina, and Lugal-Sagezi have faded into the twilight of our memory, but the magnificent civilizational blueprint they painstakingly etched into the soft clay of Mesopotamia remains the ultimate foundation of the modern world we inhabit today. As the deep, soothing hand of midnight blankets the entire ancient plain of Mesopotamia, a profound, comforting stillness settles over the ruined mounds, the quiet canals, and the endless fields of barley. The intense, noisy dramas of the warlord kings, the frantic calculations of the temple accountants, and the heavy labor of the harvest have completely dissolved into the identical, peaceful dust of history. The twin rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, continue to flow wide and deep through the dark landscape, reflecting the brilliant, timeless light of the stars that have watched over the rise and fall of our oldest dreams. Let the deep, undisturbed tranquility of this ancient world wash over your consciousness, letting your thoughts drift away from the noise of the earth into a profound, restorative, and peaceful sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.